Good evening and thanks for having me here today. It's a huge honor and a privilege. Ndị Igbo, mma mmanụ. The theme of this conference, Disruptions, Breaks and Ruptures, is particularly suited to these times. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing unprecedented disruptions to life. The self-isolation and the social distancing which the pandemic demands are antithetical to the way Igbo live and experience life. People die alone, sometimes with only a stranger to witness their deaths. They are buried without ceremony. The ill cannot be taken care of by family. Grandchildren are advised to keep away from grandparents. I have heard my mother, for this reason, refer to this pandemic as Alupongwanazu. It's not merely an illness because illnesses are a normal part of life, as is death. But an illness whose cure by manner of speech is worse than the disease itself is almost a curse. It's an abomination. For a disease whose protection has mostly to do with education, finding the right words, the right language to pass on that education becomes pertinent. And it is important that the right words are chosen so as not to alienate those it is meant to protect. For instance, there are people in the US who were against the lockdown because lockdown is a term that is primarily used in the context of prisons. So asking people to lock down did not translate to self-quarantining in their minds, and this led to a lot of pushback. In Igbo, how do we sound the alarm and translate the dangers of a disease that encourages people to self-isolate, to keep away from each other, in a culture where to be made a pariah is the worst form of punishment? The untranslatability of the language of this pandemic seems to me the perfect metaphor for the distortions that could and do occur with translations, and therefore a good way to introduce my talk. Amaka, Untranslatability/Untranslatability. As an Igbo writer writing in English, I am aware that I am engaged in a translation exercise every time I write, with all the tendencies of translation to distort and misrepresent thought and feeling. The Italians say that traduttore traditore, translator, traitor. He who translates is a traitor. A translation is always an approximation at best, an interpretation or a superimposition of one's worldview on another's. So a few days ago, I sent a children's short story I was working on to a group of children to read for me. And a friend's 8-year-old, Kene, called me from Maryland to tell me how much he enjoyed the story. And in retelling my story to me, he used the word mall where I had used market. And I found this very interesting, because, of course, Kene has never seen a market. So once he read market in his mind, he read it as mall. And this got me thinking about all the other English terms or words we have accepted and used as if they were the equivalent of the original Igbo words. So bride price, for example, which we used to mean igongo, as also many people call it, or akunwani, as it is known in various parts of Imo and Abia states. Whereas bride price connotes a trade, the sale of the bride, Igongo and Akunwani refer to negotiation between in-laws or a display of wealth, respectively. Igongo and Akunwani better represent the ceremony and the rituals of a traditional marriage than the transactional term, bride price. Another example is masquerade from Mao or Mo. The English masquerade emphasizes masking and frivolous entertainment, while completely disregarding the cultural and spiritual values of the Mao in Igbo life. It doesn't reflect the fact that these masquerades are masked spirits. Again, these examples are illustrative of the sort of dissonance that occurs when the language and the worldview are not in sync. Sometimes, the misrepresentation is deliberate. For instance, the misnaming of Ogomowani, the women's anti-taxation uprising of 1929, by the colonialists as Aba women's riots. The use of riots is meant to diminish the women's well-planned and properly executed resistance and reduce it to the level of a spontaneous and violent disturbance of peace. And of course, the outraged and humiliated colonialists didn't want to validate this uprising, and so they very deliberately referred to it as about women's riots. Another example is the terms used in the accounts of the 1803 Igbo landing, when about 75 Igbo captives being transported to St. Simon's from Savannah, Georgia, took control of the ship transporting them, drowned their captors, and according to some versions, walked into the marshy waters of Dunbar Creek and drowned themselves. It is striking to me that the word used to refer to the rebellion is often mutiny, and to the drowning as suicide. Mutiny, of course, is a refusal to obey authority. It is a rebellion against proper authorities. But these Igbo captives who took over the ship did not accept the authority of their captors. And of course, suicide in their culture was an abomination, a sin against the earth, Nsani, and would have had them rejected by the goddess of the earth, Allah. So taking into consideration the circumstances under which they drowned, it is possible that they would have been regarded back in Igbo as martyrs. However, the first account of the historic landing was written by a white overseer of a nearby plantation, Roswell King, a man for whom the uprising was a rebellion against constituted authority, and for whom the suicides had no relevance at all beyond the self-destruction of merchandise. It is important, therefore, that we name ourselves, that we write our own narratives, that we control our own stories. Our writers and our historians and our thinkers have often spoken about this need for us to reclaim our power and our identity by controlling our own stories. In his Ahajioku lecture in 1979, titled A Matter of Identity, or Ahamefula, Professor N.J.C. Echewu noted that centuries of slave trade and colonization have disorganized the Igbo man and uprooted him from his culture. That disorganization, that loss of identity is progressing. And in nowhere is it as startling as in the presence of Igbo language on the official list of languages that are dying out. As an Igbo in diaspora, as an Igbo writer in diaspora, I am particularly anxious about the potential death of Igbo. It is to me one of the enduring wonders of our time that Igbo, a language spoken by over 30 million people, is on the verge of dying out. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yet, from personal experience, I ought not to be surprised. Listening to a program on Enugu FM 92.5 a few weeks ago, the two Igbo hosts of a program stumbled over an Igbo phrase in a letter a listener had sent in. The male host tried it a few times, gave up and passed it to his female counterpart, who laughed that she was being put on the spot, and who didn't fare much better. My issue wasn't so much that they couldn't read the simple Igbo phrase, but that one got the impression that they wouldn't have been so nonchalant about not being able to read a French phrase, and they certainly would not have been quite as dismissive of not being able to read an English phrase, no matter how difficult or archaic the phrase is. Perhaps I'm being hard on them. On my most recent trip to Enugu late last year, I seem to have met more children who spoke only English than those who spoke Igbo or Igbo and English. And these are children whose parents are both Igbo, being brought up exclusively in English in the heartland of Igbo land, in Enugu. In a world where multilingualism is a gift, these children are being denied the gift of it. If a language is to a large extent the embodiment of a people's worldview, then we are enabling a generation of Igbo who come to what ought to be their mother tongue and to their culture in translation. Sometimes, when the Igbo or the culture is untranslatable, these children are left with gaps. More distressingly, they are confronted daily with a dissonance between their language of speech and the language of their world. I've often imagined that this results in a certain level of disruption, a disturbance of the mind, as if they were visited by a watcher, which tries to cause chaos on sites of creativity. However, as we hope with the disruptions caused by COVID-19, these disruptions are not permanent, and from them, a renewed, stronger identity should emerge. My plea in this paper, therefore, is that we begin the task of that renewal. I'm convinced that the reason so many of us treat our language, and therefore our culture by extension, and our Igbo identity with such casual disdain, is because we have allowed Eurocentric dominant views rooted in colonialism to misrepresent or mistranslate and undermine, and in some cases to replace our indigenous knowledge and worldviews. We do not even recognize the potency of what we have lost, and what we stand to lose. In a world guided by corruption and greed, where people do not trust their governments and so question everything, even when it is for their own good. And the recent example is the lockdown and the ban on interstate travel to contain the spread of coronavirus. The Igbo concept of Ofo na Ogu would have assured citizens that those at the top were dealing with them with akocha, clean hands. Pre-colonial Igbo communities were guided by Ofo and Ogu, justice and fairness. In the book, Interface Between Igbo Theology and Christianity, edited by Amaka Njoku and Elochukwu Uzoku, the mandates of Ogu as a virtue are listed as 1. Think well of others, do nothing but kindly deeds to all. 2. Do not cheat anybody. 3. Do not rob the blind the joy of an unusual fortune. Do not deny the blind the ownership of the Odala they found with their foot. 4. Hold on to the Ogu, and you also have Ofo, the virtue and symbol of moral authority and verbal blessing or cursing. One who has Ogu and lives by its principles can curse with the Ofo. Anyone who violated the moral and ethical codes of the society was met with righteous and swift judgment. While this is not a plea to return to the pre-colonial period, because that ship has long sailed, we can contain the spread of the loss of Igbo pandemic by preserving our language. Igbo Amaka. There is an aliveness to Igbo, a vibrancy to it, a completeness to it that not many languages, and certainly not English, can boast of. Early reviews of Achebe's Things Fall Apart, for example, praised its language Achebe himself referred to as Igbo in English. And some of the best, the freshest metaphors I have in my writing are ones that are derived from or influenced by Igbo. When I write, for example, of blonde hair reminding a character of corn silk, or when a character refers to another's hair as looking like the chewed ends of a chewing stick, or a character says that another's beard looks like the fibers of a mango, it is only because I'm looking at that hair and that bird through Igbo eyes. I often tune into Enugu radio stations as a way of surrounding myself with home. And while I was writing this, I heard an Enugu Electricity Distribution Company advert referring to this period, Ora coronavirus. I mean, the idea of coronavirus as so intensely mad as to strip itself of clothes is such a powerful image. Yet it loses its power in translation. Igbo newscasters begin by asking listeners to tontinado, and a close transliteration of this would be to spread one's ear on the ground. But really all it's saying is pay attention. Neither of which have the color of the Igbo phrase tontinani. Listen to a musician sing of women as beautiful as tomato justs. We say Ebu Nobi, I carry it in my heart, for I hope. Afum Genanya, I see you with my eyes, for I love you. Obita Madumili, one's heart is dry, for one is wicked. Okoge Amaka, your feet are good. When someone comes in when we are eating, and we're extending an invitation to that person to share our meal. And I wish I could go on and on. However, when a language allows itself to stagnate, as it appears we are doing to Igbo, when that language can no longer capture the totality of the contemporary world, not only do misrepresentations occur, but gaps exist too. One of the consequences of the recent pandemic and the isolation it causes is the rise of mental health challenges. There is no word, to my knowledge, for the totality of mental health challenges in Igbo. The word onyala refers only to the sort of madness that has people stripping naked in public, eating out of bins, sleeping in gutters. There is no Igbo word, to my knowledge, for depression, for panic attacks. And how does one begin to heal if there are no words to articulate what ails one? The work on preserving our language must go hand in hand with growing it. There has to be a structure and an intentionality to it. Igbo experts and schools and Southeast governments must work together to create a curriculum that includes strong Igbo language learning. And it's heartening to see individuals and organizations take up this call, but more needs to be done, especially on a state level. In preparing for this talk, I thought very often of my late brother, Iko Oke, who was a passionate advocate for Igbo Renaissance. And as if my thinking of him conjured him up, I found one of his poems in my mailbox. And I'd like to end by reciting that poem, which is a lament, a hope, and a prayer. The Igbo Language by Iko Oke. The Igbo language has known sweaty distress. It has known the battering of rainstorms. Sunlight, shore dryer of wetness, has also shone upon it. It has outlived rainy and dry seasons. It has known the abode of hills and valleys and walked in the land of men and spirits. The Igbo language has fought and won many wars of life and death. Yet, its plight today suggests a language other than that which our forefathers put in our hands, like the totem a father hands to a son he trusts, that our ancestral mothers gave to us like a jewel mother hands to a daughter she loves. Will this totem stagnate in our hands? Will this jewel tarnish in our care? Igbo. Are you still that language beautified by our elders? Is it you they now conspire to ostracize from the midst of the world's languages? Should the Igbo not rise as one and snap their fingers and say to Fiakwa that they would live and stay awake while neglect throttles their language? The Igbo have known lack and privation. They have known oppression and persecution, like a people surrounded by enemies. But the Igbo language shall triumph. The Igbo language shall conquer all those who seek to rub its mouth on the ground. Thank you. Dalunu. Igbo Gadi.